Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Dave Marchick. I'm currently the Dean of the Kogod School of Business, soon to be the incoming interim president of American Universities. So since the last book event, there's been a little change in responsibilities. I think just because the book events are so great, they elevated me. And today we have an amazing event with two extraordinary women authors, leaders, and I'm so excited. Um, we have two more book events coming. They were on the screen. Please sign up, and we'll send you an email. You can sign up. If you have questions, please add them to the text. Anita is going to interview Lois for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we'll go to questions from all of you. So let me introduce our speakers. So Anita McBride is the director of the First Ladies Initiative at American University's School of Public Affairs. She's a veteran of 3 presidential administrations with service to the U.S. State Department and the White House, including as assistant to the president and chief of staff to First Lady Laura Bush. She's a co-author of 3 books on the legacies of American First Ladies, including the first ever college textbook and a children's book. And she's a frequent commentator on White House operations and presidential transitions. She's on TV all the time. She's my friend, and she's just amazing. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Lois Romano has written an extraordinary book. I have it on my desk. She's a very famous journalist, New York Times bestselling author, and she, for a long time, wrote a column that everybody in Washington woke up wanting to read every day. She's worked as a reporter and columnist for the Washington Post, Politico, Newsweek, and others. She's a wonderful storyteller. She's meticulous at research, and she brings political and historical figures to life. Her new book, An Inconvenient Widow, The Torment, Trial, and Triumph of Mary Todd Lincoln, has been widely praised for its fresh, nuanced portrait of one of America's most misunderstood first ladies. The book is exhaustively researched and has a compelling narrative, and she invites readers to reconsider Mary Todd Lincoln's life struggles and legacy, both with empathy and a historical perspective. And the book is taking off. It's already on the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and New Yorker bestsellers list. And I think this book is going to cement her in a high place of America's leading biographers. So thank you for joining. Thanks for being here. And please add any questions you have to the text, and I'm going to go off camera.
Thank you.
Over to you, Anita.
Thank you so much, David. Well, Lois, good evening. I'm so excited to be here with you and to have this outpouring and really overwhelming number of people who have signed up to listen to this tonight speaks volumes about your book and about you as a well-respected journalist and now author of what I think is the best biography on any First Lady I have ever read, and you
Wow,
know
thank
I've
you.
read a lot of
I know you have.
First Lady biographies. This book, really, I will say this is an act of service. It's an act of service to the country and the telling of a fuller understanding of the Lincoln presidency. So I thank you for that. And the negative views of Mary Lincoln run so deep because of the way others have written about her. And here we are 160 years later, 160 years plus, and we're getting a more fuller accounting. Do you think that writing this from a women's perspective gave you greater insights in a fuller picture of Mary Lincoln?
That's a great question, Anita, and thank you so much for being here and doing this. And Dean, thank you for those lovely remarks, and I'm very excited to be here. The simple answer is absolutely, and in fact, I wrote a New York Times op-ed on this. Mary's biography was initially defined by a lot of men who did not understand her, and they were men that were political rivals of her husband. They were physicians that didn't understand her anxiety. And they basically portrayed her she was a caricature.
Mhm.
And I think that women need to write women's stories because you can walk in their shoes. And that's what I tried to do. And as I'm writing about Mary, and believe me, Mary was not perfect. And I say this throughout the entire book. She had some issues. She could be irascible. She could be haughty. She could get explosive. But think about what she went through. She lost three children. Her husband was shot in front of her. She got thrust into the Civil War, where more than half of her family from Kentucky, was fighting for the Confederacy. So when I read about her or when I study her, I see resilience. Where men who knew her, they just saw weakness because she was in mourning for her kids or in mourning for her husband or, struggling to get through the war. She was the most resilient woman I have ever researched.
Mm. And that's that issue of resilience, but also comes from a fact that this is a woman who grew up educated, which was really unusual for a woman of her time. But her father believed in an education for women. She had exposure to great books, to political thinkers. This was part of her early family life and her pedigree. She knew. I wanted to ask you if you can give us a little bit of her early life. This is a woman who, from the beginning, I mean, from an early age, had good political instincts. She wanted a front row seat to history. She
That's
had
true.
eligible and other bachelors who were pursuing her. And she decided pretty early on she was going to be in the White House or married to a president. Can
Well,
you?
that's what's fascinating.
Yes.
She told her sisters, she told people when she was just an adolescent that she wanted to be first lady. What influenced some of her thinking is that she was from a political household. Right up the street from her lived Henry Clay. And this was the hottest period in Henry Clay's long career. He had been Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a perennial candidate for president. He was Secretary of State, and he was at her father's dinner table. And so she was highly influenced by politics. And as her sister said, she stood in no great awe of men. And her father would invite her to these dinners or invite all the kids to the dinners at the end of the dinner. And she, became very conscious of politics. Henry Clay was her first political crush. She never lost that sort of dreaminess that she was going to marry a man and he was going to become president. And so she moves from Lexington, Kentucky, from a very well-to-do family, and as you say, she's very educated, to Springfield, where her sister lived. Her sister would bring one sister to the house, get them married off, and then bring another. And so it was finally Mary's turn, and she was the belle of the ball. I mean, in her sister's parlor, men would crowd around her. She could speak French. She would have opinions of the politics of the day, of cultural events that were going along. Stephen Douglas was enamored of her. And somewhere in there, she took a liking to Lincoln, which is not what her sister had in mind. She
Right.
she thought she'd find somebody a little more polished.
And that to that point, I mean, he came, he was a bit rough around the edges, but she saw something in him. Can you give us a bit of a description of their political life together? And they had some bumps in the road because they were together, they broke up, they got back together, but how she really helped to propel
Mhm.
him into a political career.
Their relationship is actually very entertaining, and I'm going to let people read about it in the book, but it was a little volatile. It wasn't smooth as, 1800s relationships could be. They broke up, got back together. And the second time they got back together, they kept it a secret, and they were secretly rendezvousing at someone's home. And then one day, Lincoln shows up at the minister's house and says, I need to get hitched tonight. And the minister was sort of startled and said, well, tonight? And he said, yes, absolutely, tonight. Anyway, I won't go into all the details, but Robert was born 9 months later.
Mm.
So it's a very contemporary, great story. She immediately saw a lot in him. First of all, he was a Whig like Henry Clay. So they both, were enamored of Henry Clay. in addition to her prominent family, her sister, who lived in Springfield, had married into a very prominent family. Her father-in-law, her sister's father-in-law was the most powerful person in Illinois. He had been the governor of Illinois. So Mary had the benefit of these two very powerful families, and they get married. And she, pretty soon after, I mean, it took about a year because they had the kid and then they had to get a house, but she starts entertaining, which is an anathema to Lincoln. He was self-educated, having VIP parties wasn't his thing. He was in the state legislature, but every time the legislature would gather, Mary would have a party for hundreds in their home. And so she used her connections that way to give Lincoln exposure. She was also very shrewd politically. She read newspapers, and there were, believe it or not, there were in Springfield, I think at that time there were 6 newspapers. And so she kept her nose to the grindstone. She knew all the political gossip. And they were truly full partners in politics.
And were they, as a couple, did other people around them see this as a potential, political career for Lincoln? Because he was also a fairly successful lawyer, too, correct?
He had a pretty bumpy political
Mm.
career. I mean, he was elected to the House in 47, I think. And that was it before he got elected president, which was a long shot candidacy. So they saw them as a power couple, but not necessarily that he was on a trajectory to the White House.
Mm.
He was influential. He was a very, as you say, he was a great orator. He was a great lawyer. But his career stalled in the 50s. But something happened. There was some legislation passed. It was all about slavery. And he was energized again. And he stepped up again. And he slowly moved the Whig Party to the new Republican Party and became a leader in the Republican Party.
So the one period of their life when he is elected to Congress is so Mary makes the decision, which not all congressional spouses did,
You
to
did
move to Washington with him. And they had one or two children
too.
already, two at this time. What was her introduction to Washington? How was she received?
She had very high hopes, not understanding. She thought, well, this is it, we've made it. But he was a freshman congressman. And so they immediately had to move into a rooming house. And she might have been the only woman in the rooming house
Mhm.
with two toddlers. So it was not great for her. And he was working all the time, and he liked the male camaraderie. So she was pretty miserable. I mean, I think it's no secret that she thought her life would be a little bit more glamorous in DC. And also, DC was pretty primitive. There was still livestock, roaming the muddy streets, and it wasn't a sophisticated city. So she left at, I want to say 6 months. She just got out of there.
Went back home,
She went back
went
to
to
her
Springfield.
father's home. No, not to
Mhm.
Springfield because the house was rented, but she went back to Lexington. And so she's back, and actually, her father was a slave owner, so she's back in a home with slaves
Mhm.
and being pampered, and not the life that she had just left. It was very interesting, and she stayed there for another 6 months until their house became available and Lincoln left the Congress.
So there's a lot about Mary that we know that she experienced a great deal of loss, of course, in her life. We know the worst, of course, being the loss of her husband right in front of her, but the loss of children. When the first child that died, at what point this now starts this trajectory of real sadness in her life that starts to affect her so deeply? When did that first
The
child
second
die?
child, the second child died. It was her child who died, but it was her second child, and he died in 1849 when they had left Washington, and he was just shy of his fourth birthday. And everybody who has children or grandchildren on this call, 4 years old, you're a little person. He was a big part of their lives, and they believe he died from tuberculosis, and she took it very badly. However, she was still a young woman and she got pregnant very quickly and had two more children after that. So there was still hope in her life. And then after he gets elected, her son, one of her sons, another son dies in the White House. And that was probably one of the biggest losses she had. It was her favorite son. He was 11 years old. And she she was a spiritual woman. She believed she was being punished. And she says this. She said, I was so focused on our ambitions that maybe God is sending me a message that I shouldn't do this. And she was not less ambitious, but she started going to visit the hospitals and taking care of other mothers' sons
Mm,
that were, egregiously wounded during the war.
mhm.
And in effect, she had four sons, and in some way or another, she lost all of them. Three died, and we haven't gotten to this, but her fourth son does not treat her well towards the end of her life. So
Right.
she basically, and being a mother was critically important to her. So she really effectively lost all her sons.
And this one thing that is not told well enough about Mary, you did an excellent job of this in the book, is what she did. Of course, the Lincolns are in the White House when the Civil War is around them. Their presidency is defined by the Civil War. And as First Lady during the Civil War, she was under intense scrutiny, partly because her family, of course, had been slaveholders. Her husband's trying to preserve the Union. She's not trusted by either side, but she's doing some extraordinary acts of humanity during that period. Can you tell us about those contributions?
Well, she made a lot of contributions, but one of the important things, while everybody was accusing her of being a spy, she was actually the face of the Union.
Hmm.
And she gets so little credit for this. And the one thing that I was able, since previous research on Mary, all the newspaper articles are now digitized. So I was able to see that she wasn't getting a lot of coverage. She was going to encampments. She at one point she went to the front lines with him in the Washington, D.C. area. She took a train to Philadelphia and New York with the major who had been the head of Fort Sumter when it was bombed.
A real
Um,
hero.
a real hero. And that was a huge political step. No first lady has ever done that. He's a hero. She's traveling with him. The trip elevates both of them. And in New York, she goes to, I think she went to the shipyard, she went to encampments, and she also goes to an abolitionist church, which was an extraordinary move for a first lady to do. I'm sure Lincoln was well aware of it, but she walks into the church of one of the biggest abolitionists in the country in the middle of a civil war about slavery. It was extraordinary. And she gets so little credit for that. She gets killed for decorating the White House, which when she got there, it was a mess. There were
Wow.
rats running around. The walls hadn't been painted. Um, where she made mistakes is that she understood the optics of doing all this stuff for the war. She was very politically attuned to that, but she didn't understand the optics of decorating in the middle of the war. She overran the budget, but the budget was not that big. It
Right.
was lower than the predecessor and lower than the successor. But she shopped at fancy stores, and the reporters who had been so intrigued with her for all the stuff she was doing towards the war followed her into the stores, which she didn't expect. And so now she just becomes a Southerner who's shallow, who's decorating the White House and doesn't care that other men are going to war. And it was just not at all what was happening.
And that, I think, is the tragedy of the story of Mary Lincoln throughout the majority of our history. When you,
Correct.
if you were to mention her name, it's if she spent too much money, she made her husband miserable. And talk a little bit about their relationship in the White House. I mean, I can't imagine that he did not really appreciate and love his wife, and the way that others portrayed the relationship he had with her is very negative.
It's very negative, and I want to say this, we don't know
Mm,
anything about the inner workings of their relationship because Lincoln never wrote a word negative about his wife. In fact, he wrote positive things about her. There are some love letters. He never spoke a negative word about his wife. There are a few people who, after he died, quoted him, and I'm very skeptical of that, saying that one old friend said, well, he was always worried that Mary was going to embarrass him. I think the old friend might have been worried about it, but as one historian said, just because a lot of these men didn't like Mary or were threatened by her doesn't mean that Lincoln didn't like her or was threatened by her. We get a little window into their relationship through a book her seamstress wrote, where
Hmm.
she quotes some conversations, and these conversations, she's just very blunt with Lincoln about, you need to fire this guy, and this guy is not great for you. And now Lincoln, in the end, we all know he was a brilliant strategist. He was empathetic. He made all his own decisions.
Right.
But it would be foolish for any of us to think that she was not talking to him and that he wasn't absorbing. And a lot of times she was right. She was against two of his cabinet picks. And as we know from Doris Kearns Goodwin's amazing book, The Team of Rivals, Lincoln wanted people who would disagree with him. And she warned him against two people. One was the Secretary of State.
Right.
And she was right about
Seward,
him,
right?
Seward,
Was it? Hmm.
because he immediately tried to betray Lincoln. He looked down at Lincoln. Seward should have had the nomination. Lincoln got it on a fluke. And so he immediately starts back channeling. He's talking to reporters. He's leaking stuff. And then he writes Lincoln a very famous memo. And he says, we don't have a foreign policy. We don't have a domestic policy. Why don't you let me take over these things and you can just go out and be the figurehead? He didn't use the word figurehead, but that's what he
Hmm.
meant. It was astounding.
And how did Lincoln respond?
He said, I've
Shot
got
it
this.
down?
Yeah, he just said, I'm fine. But Lincoln, and he said to his one of his male secretaries, Lincoln said, I cannot let him get the first trick. So he knew. But yet he still appointed him Secretary of State because he thought, and in the end, probably Seward did help him. He was a stalwart of the party, and he was an institutionalist, and he was from the East, and so where Lincoln was considered a gauche Westerner.
Hmm.
The two men eventually became friends, but Mary never trusted him. And then the other person she was highly suspicious of was Salmon Chase, who Lincoln made Treasury Secretary, and who then challenged Lincoln for the nomination, or was about to, but got caught in '64. So her instincts were incredibly
We're
good, and I
good.
think and I think Lincoln knew that. I mean, in the end, he made his own decisions, but I will never be convinced that he didn't listen to her. And I envision it like every marriage where
Hmm.
she would just get on to something and just keep on it and say, you're making it. And we have some quotes where she would say, he's just, Seward's just wrapping you around his finger. And he says to Mary, he goes, if it were up to you, I wouldn't have a cabinet. So
Mm.
he's trying to manage all this, but he knows she's right, and he did manage it. He was brilliant, but she had, and I have to believe he appreciated her instincts and that she was picking up all the gossip and that she knew what was happening.
Yeah, and that was part of the value too of her social entertaining is how
Hmm.
she learned about, things that
Absolutely,
were
and she
happening,
read every newspaper.
and she read everything
Right,
exactly right. And so, how did you find, because you spent quite a bit of time researching this
I
book,
did.
we all have been waiting for a while for you to publish it, and we're again, so thrilled the time that you put into it. Where did you uncover new material or what or previous writings about her that how did you approach kind of
I
changing the
think I
narrative?
think the greatest asset I had was that in the last 10 years, everything became digitized.
Mm.
So things that were buried in the archives, it wasn't necessarily new, but they were there, but it was hard to find them. The biggest thing for me was the digitization of newspaper stories. And being a reporter, I can't tell you how this excited me. And, and in fact, at a certain moment, Simon and Schuster editor wrote in the margin, do you think we have too many newspapers quoted? And I'm like, you never could have too
No.
much. And some of them were, I mean, I wasn't just quoting them and taking them as fact. I was using them for context. I mean, some of them were attacking her. And there are things that I could see, like, for example, after he dies, she goes to New York to sell her clothes.
Mhm.
Not that big a deal, but a big deal back then. And she goes under a pseudonym, and it's a kind of a sneaky
Mm.
trip. And she gets killed for it. And
Mhm.
yes, did writers write about this before that she was criticized? They did. But no one could have known until everything was digitized that 2,000 stories were written
Oh my
about this
gosh.
sale of her clothing, and probably 1,980 were negative, and they were attacking her. Why won't this woman go away? What a disgrace. Why does she say, they thought she had money. And while Lincoln did die with money, it was tied up in an estate.
Hmm.
So they just thought she was just, pulling off a scam when she was just trying to survive.
So I want to talk a little bit about that of the people who really, after his death, of course, and it took her weeks to leave the White House, right, as she was, in mourning, and then really wasn't sure where she was going to go.
Right. She didn't know where to go.
Right. And I want you to talk a little bit about that, a couple of things. One, people who were trying to make decisions, not only for her, but for Abraham Lincoln's legacy. And one of the stories in your book that was so astounding was even the selection of where he was going to be buried.
It was extraordinary.
Yes, can you tell people that?
Sure.
Because I think that story's remarkable.
She didn't participate in a lot of the funeral planning, but Mary was just smart and she knew everything that was going on at every time.
Mhm.
And people would, on big decisions, Secretary of State, Secretary of War, I think it was called, would go to her and ask questions, and she kind of kept an eye on everything. And the estate was taken over by a member of the Supreme Court who had helped elect Lincoln president. So he took control of the money, and other people took control of the funeral. And they were trying to push her to Springfield. And the truth is, she didn't want to go to Springfield. She didn't want to live in Springfield again, and she did not want him to be buried in Springfield. And it was all for different reasons, but she didn't. She had a good 23 years there, and she didn't want to go back to the house. She thought it would make her sad. She had already lost two children. And she didn't think that that was the place he should be buried. She thought he should be buried either in Washington or maybe Chicago. So they're pushing her to the house. She says no to the house. Then everybody starts pushing for him to be buried there, and she keeps saying no. And then finally she relents and says, "Okay, we can bury him in Springfield, but it has to be a tomb big enough for my two dead children and me later." And they told her that that was going to happen. She made arrangements at a cemetery, a beautiful cemetery right outside of town, which now is 5 minutes outside of Springfield, but I'm sure back then it seemed like it was New York.
Hmm.
And that's where she wanted. She had her brother-in-law call the cemetery. She found out through reading newspaper clips that this memorial committee in Springfield had bought a parcel of land downtown and that they were erecting a single tomb just for Lincoln, even after they had given their word that her sons could be buried there. She makes a big deal out of it. They say, okay, fine, fine, he'll go to the cemetery, but they don't stop building the tomb. And she finds out they had stopped work on preparing the cemetery. And so she said he's going to the cemetery. And they have the nerve to say, well, the cemetery's not ready yet. After they had stopped. My favorite part of the story is that they say to her, this is where Mary is just brilliant, and she had natural instincts. They say to her, okay, well, the cemetery is not ready. So, and keep in mind, he's 12 hours now from Springfield. The train has gone all through major states, and it's approaching the burial area. And they say, okay, well, why can't we just inter him right here? The tomb is done, and we'll just put him here until the cemetery's ready. And even in her lowest grieving moment, Mary knew that if that body ever set foot in that in that tomb, it would never leave because it had become a battle between downtown and the cemetery. So she said, if you try to do that, I will move the body back to Washington and
And
he will
put
be
it in the
buried
Capitol.
under the Capitol in George Washington's tomb, which was never used. And that they couldn't fight. They could fight her if they had interred him downtown and said, we're not moving him. But once she said that, and they just wouldn't give up. They drove to Chicago to get meetings with her, and she said, I'm not meeting with you. And she wrote a letter, which is, to me, I get choked up thinking about it. She said, he will be buried in the cemetery, and it will be an incredible place for generations to come see. And
Mhm.
that cemetery is the second most visited. I still get choked up about it. Cemetery in the country, second to Arlington. She knew
And
that. She was
she knew
right.
it. She was the only one really looking out for his
Right.
legacy
And
and
it's
could
this
see
beautiful
ahead.
tomb, and she's
Mhm.
there with three of her kids. And that's what she wanted.
So, amazing story of resilience. I loved that in your book and how you described the fight, that back and forth, and the interlocutors that she tried to use to state her case, but she put
Exactly.
the line in the sand. So there is a period of time where Mary, and she's always worried about money, of course, and
Hmm.
she's fighting to get money, fighting to get a pension, sell her clothes, all the things that she needed to do to have a decent lifestyle. And I think was very, talk a little bit about how she felt she was being treated as the widow of this well respected, well revered president who gave everything, but yet she got nothing in his memory.
She felt she was treated pretty badly, and she was, but she became also a little manic during this period. And she was incredibly concerned about money. And the executor, David Davis, wouldn't release the money. And the truth is, the money should have been released within a year. Lincoln had no debts.
Hmm.
He owed $11 on one newspaper
My
subscription.
gosh.
And she kept saying, can you give me more? He was paying her an allowance that was the equivalent of about $50,000 a year, which is just outrageous, considering she's a former first lady of the great emancipator. He's the first president to be assassinated, and he won't relinquish the money. But yet, her oldest son asks him for some money to set up a bachelor pad, and he gives him the money to
From
do
the
that.
estate.
And she doesn't find that out till after the estate settled. So starts writing all these letters, but then she gets somebody, a former tutor of her son's, to write letters, and she's a little bit nuts at this point, and she's telling him to and how to write the letters. She's sending him, there's no phone, so she's writing the letters for him and saying, don't change a word. And she's sending him to the richest men in the country who had been supporters of her husband. So it was almost like she was running a fundraising campaign. And the letters are very, very painful because you can see that she is so manic at this point. And then at one point, she tells him, this man who's writing the letters for her, she said, write the letter, but say you're someone else. And then she's sort of like really losing it here. And it's just so hard to read. And she can't raise money through the normal course that people were using then, which was newspapers like subscriptions, because she had a reputation as a spender. And so the public wasn't willing to cough up money that they thought she was spending on evening gowns. And the woman is just trying to survive. So when she goes to sell the clothes in New York and creates that fiasco, her son has a complete mental breakdown over it and screaming at her, yelling, it's humiliated, causing the executor to release the money.
Ah,
And so, lo and behold, she goes to sell her clothes. So it actually worked. And he releases the money, and she gets the money and quickly goes to Europe
right.
with her oldest son and
Hmm.
has a very enjoyable time there. She
Yep.
just said, I
So
got to get out of here.
she
She goes
goes to
twice.
Europe and she goes with Tad.
Tad, right,
Okay. And she spent several years there, kind of,
right.
because
Puts
she
him in a
had some
boarding.
health issues
She had
too,
some health
right?
issues, which I think she had diabetes, but I think some of the health issues were
Mm.
also brought on by her grieving. She was just so
Hmm.
distraught all the time, and she had some issues with her spine. But they actually have a nice few years there. It's like
Hmm.
3 years maybe. They settled in Germany, which was not her intent, but she loved it, and it was near. She loved hydrotherapy, water
Hmm.
therapy. So she was near the springs at Baden-Baden.
Hmm.
He's in boarding school. She's traveling. She makes some new friends, and it's a very nice period of life for her. You can see a little bit of hope in her heart that she's coming out of this, and she and Tad are sort of mutually dependent.
Hmm.
And then they decide to return home because the oldest son has a child, and Tad wants to see the
Ah,
baby.
okay.
And they return home, and Tad gets sick on the boat ride home, and he subsequently dies. And then she's just lost. I mean, here
And
she's
where is
now
she living
she's
then? When?
back in Chicago at that point, and now she had been turning to spiritualists
Hmm.
before then, but now she's just in a search to talk to her three children and her husband. And so she's traveling all over the country, East Coast, to visit prominent spiritualists and living out of hotels. She still doesn't have a home. I mean, she never had, she had a home for about 5 minutes. She did buy a house and had to give it up. But she basically lived in rooming houses and hotels for the whole 17 years. It's just tragic.
Fighting for her rights
Fighting.
and her dignity. And I
Right.
want to get to this one point now as we get to the end of towards the
Sure.
end of our conversation before questions, because I think this is the most illustrative of her struggle and fight for her life is with her oldest son. There's nothing more compelling than this account where he has her institutionalized and her all her rights taken away. If you can just capture that for us and what she does to get herself
I'm
back
going to
to
do
the
it. I'm going to do it briefly here so we
yep.
can get questions from others. But basically, he becomes embarrassed by her. He's not, he's actually more his mother's son than his father's son. He wants to be his father's son, but he's not. And she comes back to Chicago and she's shopping a lot, harmless. And she's spending her own money and not even the principal of her money. She's spending money from interest and she's seeing mediums and people are telling him this. And she's a little eccentric. And this is like embarrassing him. And she's acting a little wacky. I mean, you've met these people. I mean, she's harmless. I mean, she's just in her own little world, going into stores and buying things she doesn't need. Okay. And he goes to a bunch of people, some of his father's friends, and he said, you know, we need to get her off the street. And this is all about Robert. It wasn't about her. She's taking care of herself. You know, he wasn't after one biographer thought he was after her money. I don't think he was after her money as much as he just didn't want to have to deal with her anymore. And I think he was worried she was going to spend all her money and that he would have to take care of her, which he didn't want to do. But he didn't, I don't think he wanted to steal her money. So he basically rigs a trial. You had to have a quote, a trial. And she walks into a courtroom blindsided. It's already set up. The jury's seated. The judge is there. The courtroom is packed with sensationalized reporters. They hear 3 hours of testimony from shopkeepers who took her money and are now saying she seemed crazy when she bought those watches. Um, and in 10 minutes, they convicted her of being insane and needed to be institutionalized. So he then gets control of her money, and within 2 days, she's in this sort of fancy sanitarium, an hour outside of Chicago. And I'll tell you the short version of the story is he goes on vacation. She writes to two lawyers and gets herself out in 3.5 months and never spoke to him till the end of her life. She didn't speak to him for 5 years.
That was extraordinary. Again,
It's
always
just an
fighting
incredible story.
for her
Thinking about,
rights.
right, what this woman went through, you know, is just extraordinary on every level.
Well, you really gave light to the resilience, the strength, really, of the challenges and how harshly judged she was by history. And frankly, I think many who really study this presidency recognize he would not have been president without her.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, we thank you for this gift you've given to history, Lois. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
I love
Anita,
the
for all the
book.
great
It's the
questions.
best. Over to you, Dave. When you unmute.
I'm back. Thank you,
Hi.
Anita, Lois. Fascinating discussion. We have some great questions. And for those of you who want to ask, feel free to type them into the chat. So the first one, actually, which I want to see if Anita will comment on as well,
Sure, sure.
from George Willie, who's a good friend, AU alum, prominent accountant. He's been a leader in the African American community, board of Howard University. So his question is, much has been written about Mrs. Lincoln's excesses. How much can be attributed to the times in which she lived, the norms of the day, and unfair criticism? How would she be regarded in these times? And Anita, you have studied and commented on how first ladies are treated, and often it's unfair. Like we've had a lot of presidents who maybe not thin,
Mhm.
but nobody comments on them in
Sure.
the same way that they comment on first ladies. So
Well,
maybe both of you could answer that.
sure. I'll say one thing, of course, and then turn it over to Lois as well. But I think it is very difficult for first ladies, and no matter what period of time in our history. But once they are typecast or identified a certain way, it is very hard to change that narrative about them. They truly could cure the world's worst diseases, but still, if they're going to be seen through this lens of being too fancy or too glamorous or spending too much money or being crossing the line in being too overtly, political, it's very hard to walk it back. And I think even Lois mentioning 2,000 newspaper articles that she read and saw over one particular incident or period of time in Mary Lincoln's life. So you have to imagine that's all anybody is reading about this particular figure at this period of time. Hard to walk that back. And I think that goes the same for even in modern times. Of course, we're now in a 24-hour news cycle and have been for forever. And it's just hard to change the narrative.
That's absolutely right. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book was because the narrative was so fixed. And it's really, who gets to tell the story and why doesn't it ever change? I do think that I don't know if much would be different today, but I think Mary would have had some safety nets. For example, I do think she had some mental illnesses, and one was high anxiety. And today we have pharmaceuticals that could have dealt with that. So I believe from reading everything about her, that she would have been less volatile because she would have been probably taking something like Prozac. So she would have had a calming effect. The other thing that I think people realize now, or at least people around the president realize, that the first lady's legacy is tied to the president's legacy. And there would have been more effort to protect her. Protect her before he died and protect her after he died. And the title comes from that thought that she was inconvenient after he died. Everybody wanted her to go away. And the people around Lincoln, his allies after he died, a lot of them were very wealthy men. And they could have easily dealt with this problem of money by just helping her buy a house. That's all she wanted. She wanted a house that didn't embarrass her because she was brought up a certain way and she was living in a hotel, so she couldn't invite anybody over for tea. So I think the men around the president today, look, I mean, Nancy Reagan took a big hit.
Right.
But his staff did do everything they could to try to protect her, and they probably did. I mean, we don't know everything, so I think she would have gotten that protection. Where she probably, wouldn't have been protected is that she was outspoken, and she was always going to be outspoken. And why should she be protected, from that? So I think it would have been a little bit better, but I'm not sure how much.
Good points.
Got it. Okay, so we are going to go to Jackie. Thank you, George. We now figured out how to get the questioners back on screen. So we're going to go to Jackie Manuel. We can't see you, Jackie, but he is our associate basketball coach,
I
2005
see him. All
national
right, there he is.
champion
Okay.
at
Right.
North Carolina, and he's going to lead us to a Patriot League championship. What's your question,
Wow.
Jackie?
How are you doing? Thank you
Hi.
all for the knowledge that you're sharing. It's been amazing to listen and learn. My question is, what leadership lessons did you learn from Mary Lincoln's life?
I'll say what I started the first question, resilience. And she gets no credit for that. She got out there. She decided loyalty to her husband. She was going to be loyal to him no matter what. She didn't care what her family was doing. She was going to help him win this war. She was a generous person, even though she gets no credit for being generous. And also she was loyal to her country, which she also gets no credit for. And those are all leadership issues to me. And after he died, even though she was going through all of this, she still got up every day and put on a dress and got through her life. She would cry. She would be by herself in some strange town crying. But 17 years of this, I mean, the resilience this woman had to have. I think, again, I think she showed remarkable strength where people saw weakness. Does that
Well
answer your
said.
question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jackie. I think Rhoda, I don't know if you're on, or I can ask. Okay, so Rhoda Atbaum is a prominent real estate leader in Seattle, former chair of the National Park Foundation.
Mm.
And her question is, she asked about, just all the trauma that you talked about, Lois. And the question is, did you think that she had PTSD and a traumatic brain injury? Like, was there something? Oh, there's Rhoda. Okay, so um, was there something physical or was there severe trauma that led her to all the challenges you talked?
I think a couple of things. I mean, it's a complicated case. She had a history of mental illness in her family. And there's fleeting mentions of her dad. And then the siblings, I think another sibling had been institutionalized, a couple were alcoholics. So there were definitely issues there. She lost her mother when she was 6 years old. Her father immediately remarried, and that woman had 9 children. So there was 15 children in the household. And I think life was a struggle for Mary since the time she was 7. There have been some medical reports on her, and one was bipolar, because she would have highs and lows. And there's documentation, contemporaneous documentation from friends who would say she was like an April day. She could be happy and sunny, or she could be rainy. She would have had to have some PTSD from holding her husband's hand and having him shot. So I just think it's like this perfect storm that came together that defined her. And with primitive treating of mental illness, all people would say is that, well, she's crazy. But it was complicated, and I think she could have been treated with talk therapy, with some medications, and probably had an incredibly productive life after Lincoln died. But she was almost unable to move forward, which was very sad.
Thank you. Rhoda, go ahead.
What can you tell us about the accident that she was in DC, which created the traumatic brain injury?
Well, I don't know if it was a traumatic brain injury, but she did have I mean, there are some people who think that, but it's speculation. She fell out of the carriage. I think the horse took off. There were doctors there right away who treated it. It got infected, and it was treated. I don't have any reason to believe it was a traumatic brain injury. And documentation of her behavior of being somewhat volatile and erratic and having anxiety well preceded that accident. I mean, the descriptions of her having, yelling at Lincoln in Springfield, which I think she probably did, but then she would get over it in 5 seconds, well preceded that. So, I mean, did it add? It could have, but I don't think it was the cause of what happened later.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Rhoda. Good to see you. All right, I have a totally unfair question for Anita, which is, you were
Okay.
First Lady Bush's chief of staff. She is beloved by everybody. And I know that's her, but maybe you also helped. So this is a totally unfair question. If you were Mary Todd Lincoln's chief of staff, what would you have advised her?
Great question.
So I realize that's
That's a tough, that's tough because the personalities are so different. I think, part of what made my job so easy with Laura Bush, too. First of all, she had come into this role having been First Lady of a state. And so she had a set of initiatives, objectives, things that she wanted to work on. So there was a sort of a built-in portfolio. Also, her personality was one. She was the calmest person in the room, with the best judgment of everyone. Never turned up the political heat. In fact, did everything to help turn it down. It was easy to be chief of staff for someone like that. It was my job to make sure her skills and her support on behalf of the president was spread as wide and far as possible. And to do that, I worked effectively with the West Wing. I think for Mary Lincoln, the challenge would have been working with the president's team to give her the level of respect that she deserved. And part of that wanted to be seen as being an additive, not, a negative. And I think so much of how she was defined by the men around Abraham Lincoln would have made it very difficult.
That's a perfect answer because he had two secretaries that felt she was a burden, and she was
Right.
excitable, but she was wanted to entertain, and there wasn't enough money in the budget, and she let staff go so other people could do the job cheaper, so that people could come into the house, and she drove them crazy all the time. But I could see what she was doing. But to your point, they didn't figure out a way to harness her positives.
That's right.
Got it.
And that
Okay,
would
this
have
is a
been my
great
job.
question, which I love in my soon-to-be role, which is Lindsay Tauscher, who's a soon-to-be parent of an incoming AU student, says, "What should my daughter or I don't know if it's my student check out in DC that's related to Mary Lincoln?"
Oh, well, Ford's
Lots
Theater
of
is
stuff.
one
Yeah, Ford's
place, right?
Theater. You can get tours of Ford's Theater and see what exactly happened that night. And then across the street is the Peterson House where the president was taken. And I would tell everybody if they're in DC to go see that because when you read about it, it seems like it's larger than life. And when you get inside it, it's a tiny little townhouse. And Lincoln's in this tiny little room. And every man that had ever worked for him just made a point to get in that room. Even as he lay dying, they were grabbing onto his legacy. But Mary, and you'll read about this in my book, Mary was kept out of the room, which was extraordinary.
Just
But I would go there. Where else, Anita? I mean,
Well,
those
I
are
was
two.
just going to ask, I don't know if the new museum that will be underneath the Lincoln Memorial will have any reference about Mary Lincoln. It's not open yet, so I
I think
don't
they
know.
will. My friend David Rubenstein
Yeah,
funded that, and I'm going to see a sneak preview, and I think they will. So it's
okay.
going to be
So
great.
that would
There's
be
also a great
another
museum under
place.
Ford's Theater that I
That's
saw
right.
for the first time last week, and it's extraordinary. And it actually has the Derringer gun
Hmm.
that Booth used to shoot Lincoln, and it's the tiniest little thing. And I was just taken aback by it. Yeah, all
Yeah.
those things.
All right, I'm going to combine two really good questions. Karan Martinez uh, asks, it's a longer question, but I'm going to ask, how is Mary Lincoln represented at the Lincoln Library today? Is it the negative narrative or is it the Lois Romano put it in context narrative? And then the second question from Sam McCarzick, I probably messed up that name. Did Robert Todd ever make any attempt to reconcile the relationship with his mom?
Do
Those
you
are two
want?
great questions.
Yeah, they're great questions. I can just say from the Lincoln Museum, I
Mhm.
was there at the opening. So this
Okay.
is a long time ago. This is back in 2007. I have not been back there since. I do remember seeing exhibits about Mary Lincoln, but I don't, maybe you've seen it more recent, Lois, than I have.
She's portrayed positively.
Hmm.
All the archives are there, so there's a lot of letters, and some of them are negative. But I will tell you this: that as soon as the book was about to be published, they reached out to me and they asked me to do a story, a blog post,
Great.
and to write about what I found in their archives. And they knew it was going to be positive about Mary, and they played it very prominently. And they now, I
Whoop,
looked at it recently. They now have on a bestseller, compelling, positive story
good.
about Mary. What was the second part
And
of the
about
question? I already.
Robert Todd, if he did
Well,
anything to
no,
reconcile.
he didn't really. I mean, they reconciled. She went back to Europe for about 4 years, and at the end of her life, he had become Secretary of War in the interim, and she was very proud of him. And she wanted a reconciliation, and she was terrified he was going to try to commit her again, which is why she didn't want to come back. But he promised his aunt that he would not do that. So they had a reconciliation, but personally, he never reconciled it. And I find that just so sad because he himself had mental illness at the end of his life. He would have to take extended leaves from his place of employment because, somebody died or he wrote to his aunt once and said, I'm having a nervous breakdown. But yet he showed no grace to his mother. And he burned some of the love letters, it's believed. I mean, he burned some of the correspondence. So, I can't get my head around him. He's not a favorite character in my book. But I don't think he personally ever tried to understand her or to reconcile anything about her, which I found profoundly sad.
I wonder
Okay,
if
this is
he
a question that
worried
my
that,
wife, who's
yeah.
writing a book on the suffrage movement, would love, because they're, as you know, Lois and Anita, because
Mm-hmm.
there's themes about the way history is written. So the question from Hillary Wiener is, they were all male reporters at the time. If there were women reporters at the time, would there be a more sympathetic narrative to the story?
I'm not sure. There were a few women reporters, and they were not. A couple were sympathetic, but they talked about how glamorous she was and how she was going to, grace the White House and all this. But after the conviction of insanity, a lot of the women reporters just wrote the same storyline. So I'm not so sure. Would have had to been somebody brave. Ida Tarbell took it on later, and she disputed a lot of stuff, after Mary died. So, but in real time, I don't know that women. I didn't find any real evidence. What about you, Anita?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there's really any evidence to suggest she was treated any kinder.
Okay, here's the last question. Christopher Ween, can you share how the legal system was stacked against her in the trial and the hospital admission? What was the law of the day? Sounds like it was stacked against her.
That's a great question. So prior to, like a few years prior to this, any husband or any brother or son could go and get a woman committed without any legal apparatus at all. A woman named Elizabeth Packard was committed to an institution by her husband because she didn't agree with his religious beliefs, and she got herself out and got a law passed in Illinois that was supposed to have protections. But it wasn't airtight. And so that's why the protections were that Mary got a trial, but they skirted a lot of those protections. Mary should have had some forewarning about the trial, and she didn't get it. She should have had a lawyer, and she did have one, but it was somebody that they found. So during that trial, she was never allowed to speak, and there were no witnesses on her behalf. So yes, and the jury was all men. It was an all-male jury, and some of them later said that they didn't think she was crazy, but that the instructions from the male judge left them no choice. So even though this Elizabeth Packard really tried, she still was at a loss.
Well, thank you very much to both of you. I would just say that, I love reading history, and there have been a number of books that have changed narratives about historical figures. David McCullough on John Adams. I certainly think John Meacham on George H.W. Bush. That was a wonderful book. And I know, Anita, you were close with Senior Bush, and he left office basically not popular and a little ridiculed.
Correct.
And that book just told what a great person, what a great man he was. So I think your book's going to be one of those books that changes the narrative for history, Lois, and I want to congratulate you.
Thanks, David.
Absolutely.
And Anita, thank you so much for everything you
Thank
do.
you all for having us. This has been such a great
It's been
conversation.
so great.